Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Brooke Clement. I am the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. It is my pleasure to welcome you and our esteemed guests this afternoon. We're really excited about this. I will say before we continue, can you please ensure that your cell phones are turned off or are on silent? I would also want to truly thank our wonderful partners at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and as well as your continued support of this library and museum. Now, I have the pleasure to introduce the video of Dr. Colleen Shogan, 11th Archivist of the United States.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. I wish I could be there with you today for what I'm sure will be an exciting discussion of Betty Ford's 50th anniversary as First Lady of the United States. 40 years ago, Mrs. Ford inaugurated the field of First Lady scholarship right here at the first conference about this important yet often overlooked position. Scholars and journalists are only beginning to scratch the surface to understand the role of presidential spouses. As more information is gleaned about the role these women have played, I am convinced that many histories about presidential administrations will have to be rewritten. Emphasizing the role of women in our nation's history doesn't have anything to do with politics or partisanship. Instead, it's about telling the most accurate stories we can about the evolution of our democratic institutions. As the Archivist of the United States, I am responsible for 42 locations across the country, including 15 presidential libraries, from Presidents Hoover to Trump. We at the National Archives are proud to partner with groups like FLAIR, who work to promote education and scholarship about the contributions and lasting impact of presidents and first ladies of the United States. Thank you for your presence, your enthusiasm, and your commitment to the pursuit of knowledge. I hope you enjoy today's conference.
Well, Colleen used the term in the subjunctive, she hopes you enjoy today's conference. How many of you were at the lunch with us? Show of hands. Did you not enjoy the conference there? What a start we had. Well, this is a remarkable day for our foundation, for our library and museum, the National Archives, our partners at FLAIR. I hope you noticed something. When you came into this building, you saw literally written into the walls, the columns of this building, the virtues that are attributed to President Ford. Team player, integrity, candor, the ability to listen. All of the virtues. I took a walk through here yesterday and I looked at all those virtues and I thought, well, these are Mrs. Ford's virtues as well. And that's the beautiful thing about this facility. This building that has stood here for 43 years, educating this community and visitors from all over the world about an extraordinary couple. So it's really a privilege for me to be a part of this really civilizational mission to improve our society, our politics, our culture, and is so needed now. But to do anything like that, you have to have a good partnership. And we've had a great partnership with FLAIR. I'm looking at the leadership at FLAIR, and I'm thinking back at our initial planning in Washington, D.C. several months back when we were just dreaming of what this day would look like. And it's more than fulfilled our expectations. In the planning, getting to know the speakers who are going to be taking the stage here shortly, it really will be an honor to listen to people who are part of the family, Susan Ford Bales. It's going to be an honor to listen to the practitioners, Anita, Anita McBride, who's been there. It's going to be an honor to listen to the people who are the academicians who've studied the First Lady. It takes all of us to understand this extraordinary office, and it's going to take all of us to understand an extraordinary First Lady in Betty Ford. By my count, the 44th First Lady. But as I mentioned across the street, what is so extraordinary is this this wonderful survey that I just ran into by a reputable group saying that of all the first ladies in the last 60 years, she ranks number one. We have a lot to learn from her. So I hope you enjoy today. I'm delighted that you've joined us. I'm going to learn a lot, and it is now my privilege to introduce Nancy Keegan-Smith. She is the president of FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. Nancy is also somebody to talk about a practitioner. She was in the National Archives for 44 years working with the White House. So she's been there, done that. She really understands the room where it happened. Nancy, please join us. Please give her a hand.
Well, first I want to say I was 3 when I started at the archives at the Lyndon Johnson Library, and Gleaves wasn't supposed to say that, but I did start at the LBJ Library and got to know Lady Bird, which was wonderful, and then came up to Washington, D.C. I want to welcome everyone here today on behalf of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. It is a wonderful conference to be celebrating First Lady Betty Ford and her 50th anniversary as First Lady, and the 40-year ago first ever conference she had on First Ladies. And I will say, when FLAIR started talking about our first national conference, there was only one place we ever thought of doing it, which was here. And Gleaves shortened that we have been talking for about 2 years on this conference, but I thought it sounded nice that he said we want to only talking, for several months. I want to thank our co-sponsors, which is the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, American University School of Public Affairs, who has been with us from day one, and the National Archives and Records Administration. And just a little aside, Carlin is the first woman archivist ever of the United States. So we're very proud of her, and it is due to no small effort on her behalf that the National Archives is FLAIR's newest lifetime institutional member. The First Ladies' Luncheon, which Gleaves mentioned, was inspiring, and so nice of her to come when she did not feel well. And Susan, thank you for hosting those. I have so many people to thank, so I'm going to do it real short. I'm not going to try and make it like the Oscars, but I want to thank Susan Ford Bales. I want to thank Dr. Shogan, Gleaves, Whitney, and Rachel Singlo. They're wonderful partners. Anita, who is, I call her my buddy, and has just been with me every step of the way, and with Gleaves and Rachel on this conference. And all of the FLAIR founders. There were 7 women who actually conceived of this and are the FLAIR board. And there are several board members in the audience. I would like to recognize Myra Gutin, the immediate past president of FLAIR, Diana Carlin, the vice president of FLAIR, and Stacy Cordery, and of course Anita McBride. And I think I've scoped out the board members in the audience. If not, I'll hear about it later. In 2019, we all sat around, all these First Lady scholars from different backgrounds, which Gleaves described well, and we thought, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. A journalist is writing a book, an academician is writing a book. They simply don't coordinate. There's a conference at the presidential libraries. The other group doesn't know about it. And we thought, well, we need to form an association. It's about time. And it is little steps that get us to where we are. We were inspired by the increasing study of First Ladies and by the need for networking. The First Ladies Association for Research and Education became a reality on June 21st, 2021, and it is the first and currently the only association dedicated to the study of the evolving roles, history, and legacies of America's First Ladies, and continuing the work of a pioneer of First Lady studies, Dr. Louis L. Gould. In our 3 years, Flair has offered our members so many opportunities. I'm going to give you just a few, and we have Flair informational sheets outside the auditorium, right, Cleves? Yes, and we would love you to join. Flair welcomes anyone interested in First Ladies. So we've done programs, virtual programs, including on Betty Ford, Nancy Reagan, Abigail Adams, Lady Bird Johnson, Eleanor Roosevelt, Jackie Kennedy, Pat Nixon, to name just a few. Okay, we've done a whole bunch more, many of which have been picked up by C-SPAN. We do social hours, and those are important because people who care about First Ladies, Flair members, get together. Sometimes we do a program, sometimes we just let and sit them talk, and you find out really interesting things. Coming soon will be the first edition ever of the Journal of First Ladies Study, our e-journal, which is further promoting research and education about First Ladies. And again, it is the first of its kind. Another benefit of Flair is the opportunity to name someone for the prestigious Louis L. Gould Award. Research circles and lists of expert speakers bureau, just a few of the Flair offerings. So please, please do think about joining Flair. We have a whole level of different memberships. Flair has been enhanced by our partnership with our institutional lifetime members, and the Flair board members are there, and now we have a wonderful list of institutional members. And the first one, again, was American University School of Public Affairs. The first presidential foundation was the Gerald R. Ford, because I'm showing my age. I went to school with Mike Ford. And so at one of our reunions, I said what we were doing. And Mike said, well, go ahead and write me. And I did. And it took a while for him to respond. But when he responded, he said, absolutely, talk to Gleaves, we're in. You know, so the Gerald R. Ford was the first one. Flair members are the lifeblood of our organization, and we really want more members. Our 3-year-old organization is now a leader in examining the role First Ladies performed while in the White House, in American society, and globally. There could be no more fitting place for us to have this conference. And carrying on the inspiration of First Lady Betty Ford, who set her goal for her conference 40 years ago was, and I'm going to quote, "Today we have started anew, and I hope a continuing project. We have set out to look at what the role of the First Lady has been and what direction that role will take for the future." So we are carrying on today your mother's request. Flair, with our esteemed co-sponsors, takes great pleasure in honoring and carrying on Betty Ford's vision and request. It is now my pleasure to call up to the stage Alison Jacknowitz, who is interim dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University School of Public Affairs. And the thing is, Alison is so important because AU, School of Public Affairs, and the First Ladies Initiative, which Anita heads up, has been with us from day one. I told Alison when we met with Dean Wilkins, when we were first talking about it, Anita and I started talking, and she goes, "You don't need to say anymore, we're in." So it is with great pleasure I welcome Alison.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm delighted for the School of Public Affairs at American University to be a partner in today's historic conference at the Gerald Ford Presidential Library and Museum. The School of Public Affairs is celebrating its 90th anniversary this year, and one way we are celebrating is by highlighting key milestones in our history. I thought I would highlight two for you. The first key moment is the creation of our school. In the 1930s, the United States was suffering from the detrimental effects of the Great Depression, leaving 1 in 4 Americans unemployed. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised a New Deal to get the nation back to work. But how would the government implement this vast and pioneering legislation? Enter the School of Public Affairs. SBA was created in 1934 to train federal employees to solve complex problems in public affairs. Since then, it has grown to include graduate education, undergraduate education, and certificate degrees. But we continue to solve complex problems today. Another key milestone for SPA is our leadership in the area of First Lady Studies. AU's School of Public Affairs launched its First Ladies Initiative in 2011, and it's the only university in the country with such a program that promotes the legacies of Americans' First Ladies and their many contributions to our country's politics, public policy, and global diplomacy. Since 2011, we have worked in partnership with the National Archives, its presidential libraries and institutions, such as the Library of Congress and the White House Historical Association, to convene experts, such as the panel I am introducing today, to shine light on these important figures in our history. We are also proud of our affiliation with FLAIR, joining as their first partner because Dean Wilkins recognized the importance of an association focused on promoting research and education about First Ladies. We appreciate the leadership of FLAIR helping to organize today's conference that honors First Lady Betty Ford and are proud to be a co-sponsor. I am now honored to introduce the first panel. The participants in our first panel have an extensive background in First Lady scholarship and firsthand knowledge about the challenges and opportunities First Ladies face in this unique role. They will lead off the conference with a discussion on First Lady Betty Ford as a multifaceted leader. You can read our panel's impressive biographies in your program, so please now join me in welcoming to the panel author and journalist Lisa McCubbin Hill, Professor Emerita of Rider University, Myra Gutin, Professor Emerita from St. Louis University, Diana Carlin, and former press secretary to First Lady Betty Ford, Sheila Rabb Weidenfeld. The panel will be moderated by Director of AU's First Lady Initiative and former Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush, Anita McBride. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you very much, Alison. Hello to everyone. This is an exciting opportunity for all of us to be together and talk about an extraordinary woman in our history who happened to serve as First Lady. I want to ask a question. Who was here in 1984? 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, welcome back. We are really, really thrilled to be able to honor Mrs. Ford's leadership and extraordinary vision in having a convening of this type to talk about First Ladies, their lives, their legacies. And so I want to welcome this incredible panel that we're going to talk to today, and everybody has a different role to play on our panel. I'm going to start first with Lisa McCubbin, right here to my right, whose book on Betty Ford, First Lady, Woman's Advocate, Survivor, and Trailblazer, really gives us an insight into her background and brings to light also Gerald and Betty Ford's beautiful love story. So what I want to talk to Lisa about is the personality and qualities that Betty Ford brought from Michigan, right here from Grand Rapids, to the White House. It's an inspiring story of a Midwestern girl who came onto the world stage and into the White House under the most extraordinary of circumstances. I'm going to read a quote to you first, Lisa, and ask you to respond. So this is from Mrs. Ford. I don't feel that because I'm First Lady, I'm very different from what I was before. It can happen to anyone. After all, it has happened to anyone. Lisa, can I ask you to say, what did Betty Ford mean by that?
Well, I think she meant, here she was just an ordinary girl who grew up here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and found herself in the White House. Mm-hmm. And I want to take everyone back to 50 years ago. In 1973, Richard Nixon was president. Spiro Agnew was vice president. There were some hearings going on into Watergate, looking into a potential cover-up by the president. Separately, there was an investigation into the vice president about tax evasion. Mm-hmm. That was all going on. And Jerry Ford had told his wife, Betty, he was going to retire. And he wasn't going to run again for Congress. So she was getting ready for her husband to retire. Well, what happened was, in October of 1973, Spiro Agnew resigned. He admitted to failing to report $29,000 on his tax returns. And so Richard Nixon had to appoint a vice president. And he appointed the best man for the job, Gerald R. Ford. And so suddenly, here's Betty Ford as second lady. Well, 10 months later, Richard Nixon resigned, as we all know. And then overnight, Betty Ford is first lady. So in the span of 10 months, she went from being a congressman's wife who thought she was getting ready to retire, and now she's first lady in the White House.
That's an extraordinary leap and asking a lot of someone to step into. And so again, I would like if you can give us some insight to her personality, the character traits, the sense of humor, sort of her faith, too, a woman grounded in faith and her spirit, and her childhood and her background. I think any First Lady would say they bring who they are to the position. So talk about how those traits developed and made it possible for her.
Betty Ford had two older brothers, and she was sort of a tomboy. And her mother wanted to instill a sense of femininity into her, so she enrolled her in dance lessons here in Grand Rapids at the age of 8. Well, Betty Ford fell in love with dancing, and she took every kind of class available that there was, ballet, tap, Latin dancing. And then she discovered modern dance, and that became her passion. And she followed it as she grew, took every class she could. And at the age of 20, she ended up moving to New York City, and she studied under Martha Graham. And she ended up dancing with Martha Graham's company for a couple of years. She ended up coming back to Grand Rapids and taught dance here. It was a passion that stayed with her throughout her life, and which she then brought to the White House. Right. And that and her, she had a love of fashion. You can see all these pictures, or we saw pictures at the luncheon of her. She just looked fabulous. And so she had this poise and confidence that developed through that. But she also, everybody I spoke to when I wrote the book, nobody had a bad word to say about Betty Ford. They all said she just had this tremendous spirit. She was fun and lively. She was the life of the party. She loved people. And she was very outspoken. So then all of a sudden, when the press started asking her questions when she's in the public eye, she said, well, if somebody asks me a question, I'm going to tell them how I feel. And when she went into the White House, she told Jerry, you know, okay, I'll go to the White House, but they're not going to change who I am. She was 56 years old, and she said, if they don't like me, they can just kick me out. So
Well, always
she had some zingers.
and exhibited an independence and an adventurous streak really throughout her whole life. There was an example you talked about in your book that I just found so remarkable, and it's just fun, and I wonder if you would share it. She was 16 years old and went to a gypsy tea leaf reader.
So yes, she went to this gypsy tea leaf reader with a couple of friends. And, you know, they put the leaves in the tea, and this lady said to one of her friends, oh, you're going to get married and you'll have 3 children. And then the next one, she said, oh, yes, you'll be, you know, a housewife. And it was all very predictable. And then she looked at Betty and she said, you are going to meet kings and queens and princesses. You are going to have an extraordinary life. And she did.
And she did. I love that. I just had to share that. I think that those are fun anecdotes. So she says to her husband, I'm going to be who I am. Very frank and very honest. And it was refreshing. Obviously, it was a time, you know, in the country was reeling from what it was just facing. So I wanted to go to the panelists next to you right now to actually help illustrate one of the remarkable examples of her honesty and her frankness. And I'm going to read a quote to you, Myra, so that you can talk about the topic you're going to discuss today, her going public with breast cancer. So Betty Ford, and this is very brief, but it says a lot about this extraordinary woman. That's what we're here on the earth for, to help others. So how did Betty Ford influence and help others?
Well, Betty Ford came to the White House in the fall of the end of the summer of 1974. Things were wonderful. Life was opening up at the White House. And Mrs. Ford went to Bethesda National Medical Center for a regular checkup, and it was found that she had breast cancer. Her surgery was done 2 days later, and she felt right from the beginning that she was going to go public with it. I had the honor of interviewing her many years ago now. Also, like Nancy, I was 3 years old at the time. But I asked her, almost my first question was, Mrs. Ford, why did you go public? Because that was extraordinary for a first lady. First ladies just did not talk about their health. And it had only been 3 years since the publication of the revolutionary book, Our Bodies, Ourselves. But if you talk to health historians, they will tell you in many cases, it was Betty Ford who kicked off the real interest in women's health. At any rate, she said to me something that she said to Morley Safer in an interview that she did with him on 60 Minutes. She said, I thought if I had it, others had it. If I said nothing, their lives would be gone. So I think that is really plays to the quote that Anita read, that she felt that she could use that White House podium to do so much good. And we know that she saved thousands of lives because thousands of women and men went for what was then the available cancer detection services. When I was doing my research, and I'm sure that Lisa found this as well, I was shocked to find that mammography was such a new technology at the time. So there were all of a sudden men and women who were requesting that, who were asking for information about breast self-examination. Her impact there was revolutionary, extraordinary, unprecedented, and later also helped to put her in really a prime position to then become a voice for interest in research and advocacy for alcoholism and dependence on prescription drugs.
So part of the battle or what she was trying to do is fight the fear
Right.
that people certainly felt and women felt about the disease, and also illustrate the power of the position of First Lady, right? That podium is extraordinary. So the response was remarkable, not only, and she knew, it was told people were going for diagnosis and perhaps even for treatment. But what about the response that came into the White House? Was she surprised about that? I had read somewhere about the number of cards, letters, flowers.
I think she was surprised. There was some concern initially. I've been told at the White House that they weren't sure how a First Lady who had cancer was going to play. Remember, it's 1973, a much different time. And as Gleaves mentioned earlier today, people didn't talk about cancer, or they spoke about it behind their hands because there was so much fear. But Mrs. Ford really had nothing to be concerned about. She received 55,000 letters, telegrams, gifts, religious symbols. An Office of Cancer Communication was created to try to deal with this deluge of encouragement and good feeling for Mrs. Ford. That followed her through the White House and after the White House. But it was an extraordinary response to an extraordinary disclosure.
Well, one of those letters is something we'd like to share with you, if we can put it up on the screen. And actually, I'll read the note, because at the end of the day, remember, she was First Lady, but she was also a wife and a mother. She had a family, and they felt the tremendous pain of this diagnosis. So this letter, it's a little hard to read your dad's writing, so I asked for it to be printed so I could read it. Dearest Mom, no written words can adequately express our deep, deep love. We know how great you are, and we, the children and Dad, will try to be as strong as you. Our faith in you and God will sustain us. Our total love for you is everlasting. We will be at your side with our love for a wonderful mom. XXXX, Jerry. It's just really beautiful. And the other thing I learned, and it might have been from your book or the article you wrote for the Wiley Companion, is that when Mrs. Ford was diagnosed, she was not told first.
That's right.
Right? The president was told first. Can you, either one of you, so Myra, you want to speak to that first?
Oh, sure. Well, Mrs. Ford had gotten to Bethesda, and she had been examined, and she left Bethesda without knowing that the doctors were concerned about her. Later in the day, the White House physician, Dr. Lukash, and Dr. Richard Thistlethwaite, I believe, of one of the D.C. schools, School of Medicine, got together with the president to tell him about Betty Ford's diagnosis, but Mrs. Ford still did not know about it. She was then invited into the meeting, and they told her what had been found.
Well, and also when they said, we need to go in and, do some surgery to see what it is. They didn't know exactly that if it was cancer. So when she went into the hospital, they said, while we're in there, if it is cancer, we're going to remove your breast. So when she went into the hospital, she did not know if she was going to wake up without a breast. I mean, terrifying.
Extraordinary. Terrifying. And again, face that fear so others would be less fearful. So Diana, I'd like to ask you next. Again, so Myra has elevated our understanding of how extraordinary this was, to be frank and honest on this very personal topic. There were also policy topics of which Mrs. Ford was very vocal. And one of those, of course, is the ERA. And this is how I'd like to start my conversation with you and have you take it from there. So in 1990, Lisa Tobin, who is archivist at the Gerald Ford Library at the time, wrote an article for Presidential Studies Quarterly, and this is how she described Betty Ford, a woman for women. And she described how she changed from a young congressman's wife, Lisa, as you talked about, who believed politics should be left to her husband, to a first lady who by 1975 was speaking out for millions of women of her generation undergoing historic change. And for that, Time magazine named her Woman of the Year in 1975. And one way she certainly symbolized that change was her support for the ERA. So this is the quote I'm going to read to you, and then you take it from there. I believe the Equal Rights Amendment is a necessity of life for all citizens. The cabinet sometimes felt I shouldn't be so outspoken. So why was her outspokenness so important but so controversial at the time?
Well,
and here she is.
Good. Well, I think you have to think about a couple things that have already been said. Those tea leaves that were read, or her two friends, were pretty much the trajectory for most women of her age, my mother's age. You know, you gave up your career when you got married. My mother had to drop out of nursing school when she got engaged to my father because you couldn't be married in Kansas and be a nurse or a teacher. And so, you know, that was that generation. And then you get to 1975, and we've had what we call the second wave of feminism. You know, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, you have women burning bras. Those of us in college began to see that women were being admitted to med school, law school, but we didn't have an amendment that made it clear that we had the same rights. So Mrs. Ford had challenges on a couple levels. One, just societal, that, you know, she's bucking a trend. She is part of an earlier age, you know, women her daughter's age, my age, you know, we're bucking this trend. We're looking at doing something else. And she was extremely supportive of that. I know she represented, you know, the view of my mother and most of the mothers of my friends who were in college. But also she's bucking a trend for first ladies. Mm-hmm. You know, and, you know, Myra, what you said about telling the husband first, it was 1974, during the Nixon administration, before women could have their own credit. Could have their own credit card. And I mean, I remember getting my credit card in 74 and being very excited about it. And my dad had to sign on to my first bank account. So, you know, this was a huge change. And first ladies have always been idealized. They're supposed to be the ideal American woman. And up to that point, first ladies had kind of stayed behind the scenes. Lady Bird Johnson got a lot done on the environment, but she did it behind the scenes. Pat Nixon also supported the ERA. But she didn't campaign the way Betty Ford did. So you have this real clash of worlds happening in 1975. And you have, you know, feminism coming to the fore. People aren't really sure how this is going to affect anything. But you also have not had first ladies, other than Eleanor Roosevelt. Now we've had a little gap between her and Betty Ford, who've really been political. And, you know, one of the things we say about first ladies is that they're mirrors of their times, which she was on many levels, but they're also leaders. And I think if anyone was a leader at that time, she was the perfect woman because she had had a career, she stepped back, she'd had that attitude, but then she saw this platform and, you know, having a daughter of her own and looking at other young women that age, that somebody had to be a spokesperson, and she understood that. And if the cabinet was upset, it's likely because when the first lady's doing something like what she was doing, which was to install a phone in the private quarters, so she was not using government money, she paid for the phone line.
I think we have a picture of it.
Yeah, of her making phone calls. The cabinet didn't think that she should be doing this because it reflected on the president. Obviously, he was letting her do it. She's installed the phone. So then this is the president supporting the ERA. And so, you know, Betty Ford really took the role of first lady much farther as a result of that, and really showed once again that this is, you know, a partnership. And so there were a lot of things that she really did, and it was very, very much an important moment in the history of the First Lady position.
Well, one of those moments was the speech she gave in Ohio and Cleveland in 1975, the speech at the International Women's Year Congress that outlined some of the women's challenges that the ERA was intended to correct. So can you talk a little bit about some of the major points of that speech?
Yes, this is a speech. I did a program for the White House Historical Association last night for History Happy Hour on 4 First Lady speeches that made the list of the top 100 political speeches of the 20th century. And I was asked what was left out, and this was the first speech I mentioned, her 1975 speech, because she's talking during International Year of the Woman, and she's talking about the ERA, but she's also talking about the role of First Lady. So let me read you a couple things she said. But my own support of the Equal Rights Amendment has shown what happens when a definition of proper behavior, the expected, collides with the right of an individual to personal opinions. I do not believe that being First Lady should prevent me from expressing my views. I spoke out on this important issue because of my deep personal convictions. Why should my husband's job or yours prevent us from being ourselves? There's that authenticity again. Being ladylike does not require silence. And, it's just, absolutely. So, go Betty. Yeah.
Thank you, Diana. Sheila, actually, that takes me to you because in your book, you talk about that speech and you describe it as the right speech at the right time in the right place. So I want you to address that, but I want to go back just a little bit earlier when you were not yet with Mrs. Ford, and this is just 26 days after becoming First Lady, she held a press conference in front of 150 reporters where she called for the ERA. In fact, one of the toughest members of the White House press corps at the time, Helen Thomas, described it as that she enchanted reporters from the outset with her frankness and her strong stand on controversial subjects. So I'd like to ask you about this quote from Mrs. Ford. I'll do press conferences as long as I feel the press has anything to ask of interest. Can you, as someone who came from the media, how did you feel about that?
Well, first of all, it should be understood I did not know Mrs. Ford before I came in.
Right.
So I had really no idea, other than the fact that I got my cues from how she handled that incredible press conference in terms of when she dealt with her own breast cancer. And not to mention the fact that she talked about, before she met Gerald Ford, and talked about being a divorcee, and she had this amazing creative background, which I thought, wow, this is really something. So, but that was really all I knew about her, but that's why I thought this is going to be quite a woman to work with. But the one thing I didn't know, which did bother me, so I go back to this quote in a very funny way, I guess, is that, and this came out much later, after she left the White House, and that was that she did have a problem with alcohol and she did have a problem with prescribed drugs. And when I went in, I just had no sense really of those moments. There were many cancellations. There were times when people would ask me about her slurred speech, about other, and I just didn't know. I didn't know. I just knew this is an amazing woman, that was it nerves, was it this, was it that? So when you talk about the press conferences, there were no press conferences. I mean, maybe occasionally at the right moment it was how and when, but it was really baby steps, really getting to her speak on the ERA. She had to be established first. I turned down hundreds and hundreds. I mean, she was a popular figure. She should have been. She was an amazing, amazing woman. But press conferences were out of the question. There were too many times we had to cancel, too many times that people questioned behavior. So, and at that time, just like with the breast cancer, nobody really had any real sense of prescribed drugs, how they'd affected. Doctors prescribed without thinking about it. So there were a lot of women at home, and we used to talk about the Valium problems they had. You know, they're bored, they had nothing to do. Anyway, so sort of, when I talk about these baby steps, first in terms of the ERA, what a beautiful way to do it. She was amazing on the telephone. She knew how to talk. She was terrific with words. I love the way she put thoughts together. To give you an example, you know, this abortion issue is front forward, but she never said she believed or didn't believe in it. She said, take it out of the backwoods and put it in the hospitals where it belongs. I mean, she just was great. Even talking about liberated women, that if you're content and happy with yourself, you're a liberated woman. I mean, she talked to people. When, authenticity, that was it. Candor, that was it. We had to be careful, very careful. And when it came to the ERA, and I'm sure I'm not even answering your question.
No, you are.
Oh, well, good. I'm all over
You're
the
a
place.
communicator, too.
Hardly. But at any rate, so we had to be really, really careful about this. And sometimes we got into a little bit of trouble with it. But
so can I ask a follow-up to that? So if the press conferences were not the method of choice to get her message out, did she see reporters with regularity, or how else did you do it?
Every reporter asked every day. There was a war between Helen Thomas, UPN, and Fran Lewin screaming, screaming, how can I not do it? And Barbara Walters, 2 weeks before I started, but I walked and I wanted to interview all of the press secretaries, former press secretaries. So I spoke with Helen Smith, who was Mrs. Nixon. And I was always disturbed that when I was producing a show there and tried to get Mrs. Nixon on, because I thought she could humanize the president, Nixon. That would be a good thing. And I thought press secretaries did nothing. I just had no idea except say no. But this was, as everybody's pointed out, a really rough period in the life of us at that time. And we needed somebody, and they were there to soothe the wounds, So I get lost in my thought. I can go anywhere with this because it was one of those things where we really had to be very careful and where she spoke and make sure that we had, for example, I know where I was going with this. I came into the White House office talking with Helen Smith, Mrs. Nixon's press secretary, and first call I got, she handed the phone to me, was from Barbara Walters. She wasn't ready for Barbara Walters at that time at all. I knew when she was ready, and even then I knew she had to have the best interviewer around, and that was 60 Minutes. So it took almost a year for that to happen. Barbara Walters didn't get hers until we were out of, we had actually lost the election.
Yeah, here's a picture of your 60 Minutes.
Yeah, it was fabulous, and I guess we'll get to that later because that was quite a performance on her part.
We can certainly go to it right now. This is on the first anniversary of the Ford administration. Around that time, right? She agrees to do this, and as you said, I mean, you came from television. You thought this was the best produced
this was the most,
show on TV.
It was the best show. I'm out of TV talk, so I just had the utmost admiration for Don Hewitt and Morley Safer and that whole group, but she had to be ready. And I had to know that she was in good shape. So at any rate, the day came, and everybody arrived. When I say everybody, the networks, the crews, and Don Hewitt, and everybody that was associated with the show arrived early. And I went to see Mrs. Ford, who was having her hair done, and all of a sudden she told me she's not doing it. She said, Jack will do it. I said, what? Everybody's there. They arrived at 6:30. And I said, no, you're doing it. They don't want Jack. They want you. And she said, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. You're going to cancel it. And so trying to convince her, I left. And a few moments later, they called and said, okay, she's going to do it. And again, I didn't talk about the mood. You never knew that was the problem. But she was terrific. But that was the medications and stuff that we learned much later. So she just transformed herself, and she was remarkable. So we did that. Can I give you the full story? I'll try. My husband says I should try to be brief, but
That's okay. Then we're going to give your other time to everyone else. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So anyway, it was great, brilliant. I looked at the transcript, loved the transcript. Was really excited when we were all in Vail. We went to Vail, and it happened to, by the way, to have been my anniversary. My husband came in just in time for it, and I was so excited. It was terrific, and the reaction to the 60 Minutes show on the air was great. But then the newspapers had their interpretation afterwards.
Yeah, sure.
And basically one of them, for example, said Betty Ford wouldn't mind if her daughter had an affair. And then there was another one that said she wouldn't be jolted if she had an affair. So da-da-da-da-da-da. And then the tides turned and everybody was upset, the public I referred to, as was Ron Nesson, who was the president's press secretary, who started yelling and screaming at me on the telephone. And I mean, I really didn't know what to do because I thought it was my fault. What am I going to do about this? And this went on for a while, and then the president left Vail, and Betty Ford stayed on. And I had decided that the only answer to this would be to write the perfect letter that explained that this was hypothetical, that she loved her. She loved, you know, a parent should communicate with their child. And there was one other point, but at any rate, the letter was written. Betty Ford, I showed it to her. She had a friend of hers, Billy Zioli, the Reverend Billy Zioli, look at it. He added something. It was sent out, and to this day, what is it, almost 45, 48 years later, I still remember this woman's name. Lorna Chevalier from Texas got the letter. She went to Associated Press. It was published everywhere in the world, and then the mail started to come in, and everything was positive again. So it was one of those great moments.
The tide turned.
It was, it was really. And by the way, the last thing on the ERA, which was interesting as well, it came from the hinterlands again. We never put out a press release. I didn't think we had to. Her calling the people who received the calls, who weren't necessarily in favor of ERA, but were so excited. Even Barry Goldwater got a call from her. And she but she was brilliant on her point. So that's a long answer to a short question.
No, it is a great answer.
You know, Anita,
gave a great prescription.
We might want to clarify who she was calling.
Yes.
Remember, once Congress has the amendment, it has to go to the states for ratification. So she had to call members of state legislatures. So those phone calls were being made into the states that had not voted yet for the ERA. So like you said, a lot of them were opposed. It was a little like what had to happen with the 19th Amendment. You have to get all those states behind it. So she's calling into state legislatures to get the legislators to pass it.
But just in case people don't understand, I checked this out first also to make sure that, because I knew we'd get a lot of people saying she's not allowed to call individual. But this was states it was a national amendment. So.
Yeah. Yes, Myra.
I just want to add something. Actually, this is a postscript to the 60 Minutes interview, and really shows you such a nice side of Mrs. Ford. Morley Safer had asked for an autographed photo of Mrs. Ford after the 60 Minutes interview, and she did send him the photograph and said, "For Morley, for all the questions you didn't ask, thanks." I thought that was wonderful.
That
just thought that was wonderful.
Again, the personality, the spirit, and really one of my favorite photos of Mrs. Ford is one that's on the cover of your book. And I'm wondering if we could show that, because that shows her spirit and personality as well. And talk about, I mean, we all know the famous one for standing on the table was alluded to, I think, in Gleave's remarks of her dancing. But this Zen, wonderful photo, can you tell us why you used that and a little bit about it?
Well, I know Susan has never liked this photo.
I love it.
Had a little battle about that. But our publisher had the last word. And so, I mean, we searched and searched for the perfect photo to put on the book cover. And, you know, everybody knows the dancing on the cabinet table. And I was doing my research and found that you can look at the contact sheets, David Kennerly's contact sheets of all the photos he took.
Sure.
And so I went and looked at them, and I realized there wasn't just that one photo of her dancing. She did a whole bunch of other poses in there. And so I found this, and it just, you know, framed perfectly. And to me, it shows her spunk.
Yeah.
It's just, and then we had it colorized for the book, which David Kennerly allowed us to do. But the way that happened was, you know, it was the last day before they were about to move out of the White House, January 19th, 1977. And she was going around saying goodbye to all the staff. And David Kennerly was with her with 3 cameras around his neck. And, you know, it was very sad, but she was ready to go. She was, I think, holding everybody else up. And, the rest of the family was sad. She said, "It's okay. You know, we've had a good time here." And she walked into the cabinet room and she said to David, "You know, David, I've always wanted to dance on the cabinet room floor." And he said, "Well, Mrs. Ford, this is your last chance. You're moving out tomorrow." So he said she took off her shoes and leaped up there and started posing. And
I love
that.
it.
And the picture,
sorry,
that picture of her dancing on the cabinet room table didn't come out in the press until years later. And David published a book, and he showed it to President Ford, and he had never seen it before, and he wasn't too happy about it.
Well, that actually, because I wanted to ask about that because this directly sort of correlates to the East Wing versus the West Wing, and which I want you to speak to a little bit, Sheila. This is truly, obviously, the West Wing domain. This is the president's domain, and to see the First Lady sitting there. You mentioned a little earlier about Ron Nessen, the president's press secretary, not being happy with the immediate response to the 60 Minutes interview. And at least I know from my experience of being in the White House, you never want the First Lady to be the distracting story, right? It's hard. It doesn't go over well with the West Wing. Can you talk a little bit about the East Wing, West Wing relationship and how they began to understand what the asset that she was, right?
It took a while to understand what the asset was. They really wanted nothing to do with the East Wing. As far as they were concerned, I mean, there was like a Cold War going on. They just wanted the First Lady to pour tea and not make waves. You know, just do your thing, be the wife. And that wasn't going to happen. And it didn't happen. But it was really interesting to me. I would handle all the news. Everybody was always asking, what's wrong with her, you know, when things happen. And the press would always say, thought it was her, the cancer coming back. And of course, no. So it's any excuse I could give other than anything. Well, she's had a lot on her schedule, whatever it may be, something above and beyond that, so that we didn't talk health. And then I remember this one occasion when she went to Bethesda Hospital, Naval Hospital, to have a checkup to make sure that she was okay regarding the cancer. It was decided that Ron Nessen would take over this important issue now, really, having no understanding at all of how it had been handled, how it should be handled. And that was about the only time they intervened, except for the fact, once she became terribly popular because of the ERA, essentially, they decided that she had a campaign, which I thought was a really bad idea because of the pressure that was too much, and it was not good for her. So we had this running problem, and she turned into, you know, the way I used to put it was that I wanted her to be Betty Ford, not Mrs. Gerald Ford, doing his thing in his style. And what happened when she went on the campaign trail, basically that's what happened, that she had to sort of succumb to being what the podium princess, I don't know what else to say, but the wife. And the pressure of all of that did take a toll on her. So it presented a lot of difficult situations for her and for me in terms of...
She was so popular. People
so popular.
But she was relatable.
But it took a toll on her health. It did. I mean, I think that was what was so refreshing, and people... But that wasn't the campaign, though. But the campaign was a little difficult. Then people really started to question from mail and everything else. How come?
You know, one of the things that was interesting was how somebody turned that on its head with being the wife, with the buttons, vote for Betty's husband.
Yeah.
You remember those buttons?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I love that because that really flipped it.
And even Betty for president.
Yeah, Betty for president.
Do you have those in the library? Are they part? Okay.
Good.
But I'd also love to throw out one other way in which, so how did we do this? Why did everybody think that you can be great in office publicly, and then all of a sudden you go out and you announce that you've got these problems? And so the question is, how do you balance those two? Well, she did not do all these press conferences, but she did do things that got her out there. For example, I think some of you, when I look at the audience and see you're of age to remember citizen band radios, where you could talk to truckers and anybody from your car. She was terrific on that, and she learned the lingo, which was really...
Oh, my God.
Yeah. The Smokies were her, her Secret Service.
First Mama?
Yeah.
That was her
First Mama, yeah.
First Mama.
Yeah. There was a little contest, and by the way, I won on that one, on what her handle would be. But it really, it was wonderful. I mean, these people who would never have had an opportunity to talk with a First Lady were
Right.
talking to her. So
So she was willing to do things
She
like
loved that.
Go on
Well,
television.
yeah, but
Didn't she
she
go on some television shows too?
she
or-
did Mary Tyler Moore.
Mary Tyler Moore.
Yep.
Yeah, which was a popular show
Which very-
at the time. And did she like that?
She loved it. We changed a thing or two around. I mean, you know, I'm out of TV.
Yeah, yeah,
I get a little bit
exactly.
of that. So
Diana, I'd like to ask you, with all these things that Mrs. Ford has done, again, we've spoken to the fact what a trailblazer that she was. How did her example help open the doors for first ladies that came after her?
Yeah. Definitely, she made it possible then for Rosalind Carter to be as active as she was on mental health, to go testify before Congress. Eleanor Roosevelt was the only first lady who'd ever done that before. And like I said, other first ladies had worked behind the scenes. And so she really opened that door and I think cemented that notion that other first ladies had had, that it's okay. You don't have to be silent anymore. Mm-hmm. You can take on an issue. You can go before Congress. You can be the honorary chair of a commission. And, previously, if you look at the history of other women's issues, suffrage, there were women who supported suffrage. Susan B. Anthony met with Julia Grant and some other first ladies, but they didn't dare do anything publicly. Mm-hmm. And Betty Ford, it was fine now to speak on the ERA, to make phone calls, to be out there and to show a way to handle the criticism. And so I think she did pave the way for women to be a lot more active and to show that silence wasn't necessary and what your husband's job was. And what that also did, this is an unusual position. It's not constitutional. There's no law setting it up. Mm-hmm. It's sort of grown from when Martha Washington showed up in New York, our first capital, and George says, oh, by the way, we've got all these things scheduled for you. And he made it clear this was a partnership because the president's also head of state, which is all the ceremonial piece. Right. And so, that was sort of where they had been, that was their niche. And so Betty also took the fact that she had been a housewife. She could speak for all women. And I think that was important because she had stepped back, but she'd had a career. She's looking forward. And so she's taking advantage of what's going on socially. And I think that once again gave other first ladies an opportunity to look at what was going on socially and how do you develop your issue, your niche out of what's happening in society and how your unique role. Because these, when I teach a class on first ladies and they start reading, they go, they're like normal families. They have kids with issues and they've had, their husbands have had health issues and they're like real people. And I think that was one of the things she really showed too. I think a lot of our other first ladies have been able to show that kind of vulnerability as a result.
Right. Yes, Sheila.
I just didn't quite finish, and forgive me for answering the question about the East Wing versus the West Wing.
Okay.
Because a lot of it was the definition of turf. And there's been no definition to the East Wing for sure. So my idea was they stood for the head, we stood for the heart. They were policy, we were the compassion, we were the ones. But it was so interesting because I started with the staff. I mean, it was almost the entire time I was doing, and listen to how popular she was. You can imagine the press coming in. I had 3 people, including me, to handle all of this. I had no tools of the trade. I didn't know what was going on in the news. They wouldn't give me wire services, AP or UPI, which were everywhere. There were just all of these things to try to get things done that just made no sense. They didn't understand it. Well, if so-and-so doesn't have it on the West Side, you certainly don't need to have it, kind of thing. So I think, Anita, when you came in, a lot of this had been rectified.
Yes, definitely.
Size of staff had been...
Huge, almost, yes, too much, but yes. But that's true.
Well, that's true. I think that is true, yeah.
And that is a tension, always, between East Wing and West Wing. Again, the First Lady's not the constitutional authority. We all have said that here.
So how do we get this done?
Right.
I found out pretty early, you don't tell anybody on the West Wing what you're doing. And you do it, and that went for 60 minutes as well, until the day it was aired, so.
Well, that's pretty extraordinary. Yeah. Well, then anybody who has worked in the East Wing, does understand it is the heart of the building, no doubt about it. And you do have this wonderful balance of being able to work on important issues that really do matter, but also be the caretaker of the White House and preside over remarkable things like the bicentennial, which you're there for. And of course, we have wonderful memories of the Fords opening up the White House to Queen Elizabeth and celebrating this remarkable birthday, which, by the way, the country's going to be celebrating its 250th in 2 more years. So I hope that it is every bit as celebratory as it was back then. Lisa, if I could go back to you a little bit too on some of the other things that you uncovered in the research for your book that you want people to know about Betty Ford and her background and spirit and personality.
Well, I just, when I first was given this opportunity to write the book, my editor at Simon & Schuster actually came to me with the idea, and I really didn't know anything about Betty Ford. And my husband was a Secret Service agent, and he actually was there during the Ford administration. And he said, "Oh my God, yes, Betty Ford was an amazing woman. You have to write this book." And so, I thought, okay, let's see. So the first person I wrote to was Susan Ford, and she didn't know me. And we set up a meeting. And from that meeting, I fell in love with Susan first because she was so open. She has her mother's openness and candor and down-to-earth personality. And I just fell in love with Betty Ford. And every person I spoke to gave me sort of a different piece of her. I think she was just so refreshing to the American people. And people have said that Gerald Ford was the right president at the right time, and he really was all about healing the nation. And Betty Ford realized that the time that we were in and how that was important to be open and honest and have that candor with the American people. She realized then after the breast cancer that all that reaction that she got, suddenly she had this platform, and that was empowering to her. So she had this voice, and she wanted to use it for things that were important to her. She had, growing up here in Grand Rapids, she had, a really nice childhood, but her father died when she was 16. He committed suicide. So her mother now had to work. She hadn't had to work before. There wasn't money, and her mother went out and got a real estate license and started supporting the family. So that was inspirational to Betty, that, okay, you don't have to rely on a man. You can do this yourself. And then Betty got married to a man before Gerald Ford, Bill Warren. It turned out not to be a good marriage. And at that time in the 40s, divorce was really taboo as well. And it took courage for her to get divorced. And she just had enough confidence in herself to do what she needed to do. She swore she wasn't going to get married again, and then Jerry Ford swept her off her feet. And in my book, I do talk about their tremendous love story. Just they really had such a beautiful love story and have a beautiful family. Loved their family so much.
It's a wonderful description of her. And Sheila, you didn't know Mrs. Ford either when you were interviewed for the position, right? And then you describe in your book, you saw her press conference on, or saw that she went public with breast cancer. And you said, this is a gutsy woman. I think I'd like to work for her.
Absolutely. And she stayed that way. I mean, it was just a matter, again, of her having to dealing with health problems. And how do we do that? Because she was the perfect person for the times. And it was also a time when, as I said earlier, when people didn't understand prescribed drugs. And if we had talked about it then, it's not that I lied or covered up anything. It was just that we had to figure out how and when. What was the right time? What was the right moment? Of course, when you do something like the ERA in Cleveland for that International Women, you think everything's in order. Everything was. But if you go over her agenda, you will see there are very, very few interviews that she did. A lot of what she did, as I said, either came out from the hinterlands. She did some major shows that were really important. Barbara Walters, at the end, I happened not to have... So one time I wasn't around because there were other things going on. She was doing a tour of the east of the living quarters, and something was going on up there that I had to deal with. So I missed that part, but I wasn't really on top of it even until very recently when Barbara Walters died, and the New York Times had an obituary about how the one thing that she left, that she edited out of one of her shows, out of that show was, or I don't even know if she ran it, but she said that, in fact, she said she didn't, was because Betty Ford was not doing well. But they didn't even talk about it. She said today she would have done that.
Yeah,
because people do talk about
a different
these
level
things.
of respect.
Different
I
times.
think,
But that she was able to, in a sense, people still knew her. I mean, so this was, and set this legacy, which of course her major legacy is the Betty Ford Clinic, which she was able then to do. So,
Myra, you wanted to add?
Well, this sort of speaks to, again, her sense of candidness and who she was. As I was speaking with her, she was very critical of Rosalind Carter, who was then in the White House. And Mrs. Ford said to me, she isn't doing enough for ERA. And I was taping the interview, and I said, Mrs. Ford, perhaps I should turn off the tape recorder. And she said to me, oh, don't do that. I'd say it to her face. Okay.
Yet they developed an incredible relationship, right?
They were together on the stage for the...
for 1984 when you were here. And what I thought was remarkable that they did 2 years later, in 1994, the two of them went to the Hill together to testify as the healthcare reform was being debated in the Congress under Mrs. Clinton. And the two of them were together. I think, again, that's the power of this position of First Ladies. It really transcends politics. And yes, go ahead.
Can I also just quickly talk about the fact that once again, there was all of this good feeling for Mrs. Ford that was engendered by her being candid about the breast cancer. And now they're out of the White House. And she makes the statement that she is addicted to prescription drugs, later on that she's an alcoholic. And that experience with breast cancer gave her the agency, the strength to be able to address those issues. And she was so tremendously effective with the Betty Ford Center. Again, I couldn't agree with Anita more. And Sheila, that is her legacy. But her work in the White House also is a wonderful legacy.
Without a doubt. Diana.
Well, and moving women forward, about a month or so ago, the Nixon Library and Foundation did a half day. Anita and Nancy and I were part of that, and other FLAIR members, on women in the Nixon administration and the 1974 law that got credit. But it was more than that. The commission that happened, remember Title IX happened during that period. And Pat Nixon was very vocal about wanting women appointed. And Betty picked that up. You know, Betty Ford also was very public about wanting a woman on the Supreme Court. There were women ambassadors appointed during the Ford administration. So, she took that and ran with it too. And once again, I think it goes back to what she said in Cleveland and why she was supporting. She wanted women of all types to be able to do what they wanted to do. And in the speech, she also talked about the fact that we needed to remove the word just from in front of housewife.
Yes, that was important.
You are not just. That is a career in and of itself. And that really foreshadowed the speech that Barbara Bush gave at Wellesley, where she said women should be able to make choices. And then Hillary Clinton went to Beijing and had the same language, but that language was first in Betty Ford's 1975 speech. And she opened the doors for us to look at women being able to make decisions, to have openness, to be able to choose a career, choose to be at home, and not be criticized for the choices that she made. And that, I think, was very important.
One point you mentioned about Mrs. Nixon and supporting more women being hired in the federal government, also had hoped that her husband would appoint a woman to the Supreme Court. Mrs. Ford hoped
Oh,
for
yeah,
that
she
too,
said it too, yeah.
right?
Absolutely,
And there
yeah.
were serious conversations about
Pillow
that.
talk.
The pillow talk.
pillow
that
talk,
she described. And I would imagine was disappointed,
Yes.
of course, when it didn't happen. And I can't remember who, I think it was John Paul Stevens, I think was named.
That's right.
Of the Supreme Court. But the important thing is, she used her position and her leverage with her husband to put this topic front and center. Which,
And by the way, we
yes.
still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yes, that's right.
We don't.
So I think we
right.
all need to work on that a little harder.
Yes, exactly. It's not over. So we have about 4 minutes left. I thought I can give everyone an opportunity with one last question. I'll start at the end here. Sheila, what do you think was Mrs. Ford's greatest strength as a communicator?
I think her authenticity, her candor, absolutely. She was so refreshing. That was it.
Yeah.
And which was then unpredictable. I mean, because nobody would have expected this. So that's what I would put on. And I would also say that her being in the White House gave her the means to be strong when she left the White House and be credible when the Betty Ford Center was opened. So I think they all are one big package and a great tribute to her and an enormous legacy for the world.
Great. Thank you. Diana, what do you feel people should know about her leadership?
Well, I think this authenticity and credibility. I think one of the things that she had was credibility because she had been there in so many different situations and she was honest. She was willing, also her sense of vulnerability. She was willing to put herself out there and nobody knew really how the media or the public was going to react to suddenly saying the word breast on the nightly news, or talking about cancer, or then later about her addictions, or saying, I may be the president's wife, but I don't have to be silent because the ERA is important for women of my generation as well as future generations and younger women. And so she had that credibility because she did show that vulnerability. She showed the humanness in her own experiences, and she was willing to use those experiences very publicly.
Thank you. Myra, as the one person on this panel who was here in 1984 as well, along with the other half a dozen people here, what would you like us to know from your recollection and memory from that moment?
Well, in some ways, it's not an understatement to say that conference changed my life because I had gotten my degree from University of Michigan in communication, and I thought I would, after my dissertation, which was on First Ladies, I'd go back to teaching interpersonal communication and nonverbal. And I came to this conference on the advice of my doctoral advisor, and I just remember shaking my head and saying, this is amazing. And I also made I had the chance to meet Dr. Lewis Gould, who is very much the person who helped to develop First Lady Studies. And it really was the beginning of a different career that I certainly never had anticipated. And I always have felt really just great gratitude to Mrs. Ford for having called that conference. And I'm sure there were plenty of people who were shaking their heads saying, why does she want to do that? Really? But I thought it was extraordinary, and for me, it was an extraordinary event. It changed my life.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, thank you. We're grateful for everything that you are doing to write about First Ladies and help us all learn more. I'm going to give you the last word, Lisa, because I started with you.
Well, I
so
think
I'm going to end with you.
Betty Ford has inspired so many people in so many ways. She's touched literally millions of lives through the Betty Ford Center, through what she started being open about breast cancer, the millions of dollars of research that brought this to the forefront. It's just, you can't overstate the impact she's had on people around the world. And I think people should just know more about her. So.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this panel has been so excellent today. You all for 4 people. It's hard to stay on time. We are on time within 2 seconds. I mean, this was extraordinary. Hope you all enjoyed it, learned a lot about Betty Ford as a girl from Grand Rapids and rising to the highest, levels of our country and being really an example of leadership, strength, resilience, and love, and not only at home, but around the world. So that concludes our first panel. And first of all, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
And thank you. It's excellent.